Hi everyone, we are on to chapter 10. We're moving along quickly, so I hope you're able to keep up. Chapter 10 is a very interesting chapter. It deals with strategic management and the whole concept of strategy. You were introduced to strategy when we spoke about planning in chapter 8. If you remember, a strategy was presented as a type of plan. It is a long-term comprehensive plan that attempts to allocate and direct the organization's complete resources in a manner that fulfills a broad, long-term objective and the mission of the organization. The strategy, therefore, is that long-term comprehensive plan, as we mentioned. Well, we're going to go into a little more detail because strategy is, the cornerstone of the organization's attempt to create and sustain a competitive advantage. If you remember, when we spoke about competitive advantage in chapter 1, we said it was this core competency that distinguished or differentiated the firm from its competitors. It essentially allowed the firms to perform superior relative to its competitors. It gave the organization a distinct advantage, and the organization creates that advantage, realizes that advantage through strategies and strategic management. So obviously this is an important part or facet of the planning process, and that's why we're going to spend some time looking at it and trying to understand clearly the roots of strategic management, as well as how it can help the firm in terms of fulfilling its mandate of creating and sustaining competitive advantage. So the basic concept of strategy, as I just said, is this idea or this concept of competitive advantage. You want to be able to do something so well that you outperform your competitors. We talked about companies like Apple, like Walmart, that are leading their industries. They are doing so because they have a competitive advantage. They're better than everyone else. In terms of sports right now, in the NBA, you see LeBron James and Miami Heat. They continue to make it to the NBA Finals and continue to win. They have a competitive advantage. But because they are continuing to win, we can not only say that they have a competitive advantage, that they are able to be better than their competitors in just 1 year, but because they're able to do it continuously, we say they have a sustainable competitive advantage. And that's what firms really want. They want to be able to sustain their superiority over a period of time that then allows them to build on their early success and to grow even larger and better than they were previously. So that's really why we practice, why we formalize and implement strategy, as you will see, in order to create and to sustain a competitive advantage. And you've seen this before. We spoke about this when we looked at chapter 1, the sources of competitive advantage, technology, cost and quality. I'm sorry, chapter 4, competitive advantage, technology, cost and quality, knowledge and speed, barriers to entry, financial resources. These are all things that firms can use in order to distinguish themselves from their competitors. Technology, if they have a certain type of innovation, even if that comes in terms of their knowledge base, or let's say their machinery, or some piece of software that they have, something that allows them to separate themselves from their competitors. The cost and the quality, we talk about an organization like Walmart having a very low cost structure that thereby allows them to have lower prices, and that attracts customers, and that gives them a competitive advantage. The knowledge and the speed, Apple, in terms of how much information, ideas come out of that organization. Sometimes organizations have advantages simply because they have constructed, or the environment has constructed, these barriers to entry for them, meaning that other firms cannot compete in their industry, and that therefore allows them to be successful. Think of a company like Entergy that does not necessarily have any competitors because of barriers to entry, that then helps them in order to be successful. And then other firms or other organizations have financial resources, and because of their high levels of financial resources, they can do things that other firms cannot, and that then gives them that competitive advantage. Well, we've seen this before again when we talked in Chapter 8 about planning, but just to remind you what a strategy is, a comprehensive plan. So it is a plan, it is a method, it is an approach to realizing some type of objective. It is a set of actions, as we said a plan was in Chapter 8. It's a comprehensive plan, and what we mean by that is, of course, it is created most times for the entire organization, and it guides the organization in terms of allocating resources. It basically tells us what we should do, where we should put our money, our people, our machinery, our technology, our information. What are we doing here? And also, very importantly, what are we not doing? Because when I teach strategy, I try to explain to my students many times, strategy is a game of trade-offs. Because you have finite resources and because you cannot utilize those resources everywhere, you have to make very tough decisions many times about what you will do or what you can't do. Walmart cannot attempt to be a low price leader and also have the newest and best looking facilities. It just can't happen because in order for them to have low prices, they have to reduce their costs. But in order to build great and grand facilities, you have to spend more. Those two things are incompatible many times. And so organizations have to trade off. And that's what strategy is determining where I will spend my money, where I will allocate my resources, and where I won't. And you're doing this in order to achieve a long-term organizational objective or goal. That's what you're doing. And the strategic intent, of course, is related to that because it focuses all your energies on that goal. If we're going to be low cost, that's what we're going to focus on. If we're going to be differentiated, unique, that's what we're going to focus on. We must have an intent. This is also something that would be familiar to you from Chapter 1. We looked at the different levels of business, and it is similarly, you have different levels of strategic management. At the very top of the organization, the corporate level, where you have your CEOs, you have your heads of your regions, your vice presidents, your heads of functional areas, chief financial officers, what have you. Those corporate people or corporate entities, they set the long-term direction for the entire enterprise. So corporations, with respect to businesses and strategic management, can be defined as a group of business units, So, for example, if you look at Apple, one can say, well, Apple has multiple business units. They make tablets, they make iPhones, they got iTunes, they got all of these different areas in which they're doing business. They got commercial businesses, business lines, as well as consumer lines. Those are different types of businesses that Apple is part of. The collection of those businesses is called Apple Corporation. That is what a corporation is, a collection of businesses. And at the very top, you have the CEO of Apple and the top management team. And what they do is they decide and they determine what is the direction, what is the mission of the entire organization. Not just for Apple iPod or Apple tablet or Apple iTunes, but for the entire organization. I'm sorry about that. If you want to think of this example, it might be helpful in terms of illustrating what a corporation is or what a corporate level strategy is. Think about our university, Xavier. Xavier University, at the very top, we have our CEO. We don't call him a CEO, we call him a president, and we have President Francis. President Francis is our CEO. He's our corporate leader, if you will, and he sets direction for the entire university, which includes two colleges, the Colleges of Arts and Science and the College of Pharmacy. And so when he creates these agendas and these strategic plans, it is for our entire university. Where does he want to see Xavier grow? And at a corporate level, you make decisions such as, what types of new industries I want to get into, and also what type or what industries I may want to get out of. Okay, so that's what the corporate level does. They decide for the entire organization. Below the corporate level, you have the business level. And at the business level, those strategic leaders, their job is to create and implement strategies specifically for the business unit in which they are leading, and therefore the industries in which they are competing. So we go back to the Apple example, and let's say I am the vice president of Apple iPhones. Well, what I am doing is that I am competing in my business unit with all the other smartphones in my industry. And my strategy, therefore, should be created and implemented in such a way to make me the leader in the smartphone industry. That's all that I am concerned about. As the leader of that specific business unit, my role or my job is to create strategy to make me the most successful business in that specific industry. So business leaders, unlike corporate leaders, set strategy only for the particular business or type of business they find themselves in, they compete in. And it is at this level, it is at the business level, that organizations are actually able to create and sustain competitive advantages. It's because at each business unit, if corporations can be successful in their individual business units, if they can create and sustain competitive advantages in their individual business units, then the corporation as a whole is going to be successful. Let's use the example of Apple again. If Apple is successful, is the leader in smartphones, and is also the leader in tablets, and it's also the leader in laptops, then Apple Incorporated, the entire corporation, is going to be successful. That's how corporations become successful, when their individual business units do well. So it's the business leaders that set strategy for their specific business units. Okay? But obviously, those strategies are influenced by what the corporate level wants, where the corporate level sees themselves, sees the organization, I should say. And below the business level, you have the functional level. You have the functional level, and those functional levels, they are the ones that guide the activities for the specific area of operation. So in the business level, you have the business leaders of the business units dictating what we should do here for this business unit in this industry. The functional leaders, these are the heads of the departments of finance or accounting, of marketing, for these specific business units. So I might be, let's say, the head of accounting in the iPhone business unit of Apple. Well, my job is to create and implement strategy for specifically accounting related to iPhones. Is that understood? So what we're having here is a or I should say, what we're having is a delineation, and we're becoming more specific the lower we go down in terms of the strategic hierarchy. So at the very top, corporate sets this broad mission and vision. Below that, business becomes more specific in terms of where should we lead this particular unit. And at the functional level, we become even more specific and get onto the operational plans of the organization. The operational, sometimes the tactical or functional plans for that particular organization or that particular part of the organization. So corporate sets the tone for the entire organization. Business is concerned with their specific unit, their specific industry, and functional is concerned with their specific department. So it is essentially, to some extent, becoming more specific as we go down. And in the higher levels, the corporate and business levels, that's where we formulate more strategy. That's where we kind of come up with the plans and create the ideas and set the plans in place. And in the functional level, while there is some formalization, there is more so implementation of the strategy. So at the functional level, there is more implementation. The business and the corporate level, there is more formalization, if you will, of the plan. And this is simply how it looks, a good illustration. At the very top here, you see the corporation. We're asking the question, what businesses are we in? We're right now in A, B, and C. Should we get into D perhaps? Should we get out of B? That's some of the questions that the corporation asks. Corporation might want to say, okay, do we go global? We looked at that in chapter 5. Should we start looking into China, maybe India, some of these places? That's a corporate level decision. That is like President Francis say, well, should Xavier build another campus in Lafayette? That's a corporate level decision. Because at the business level, here's the question they ask. How do we compete in each one of our business? So the leader of business unit A, their job is to simply be competitive in the industry in which Unit A finds itself. It doesn't really concern itself too much with what's going on in B and C. Well, that's their job. That's similar to the deans of our colleges. The dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, his or her role is to create and implement strategy to allow those departments, those degrees in the College of Arts and Sciences to be successful. He or she is not necessarily that concerned about what's going on in pharmacy. That is the dean of pharmacy's job. So these business units, they are trying to be as successful as they can in their specific industries. And below them, you see for strategic business B, unit B, they broke it up. Here are these functional areas. These are these if you will, subdivisions or subdepartments. And what they're doing is they are contributing functionally, tactically, and sometimes operationally to what's going on. Their question is, how do we best support the strategy? What do you need me to do, leader, in order for us to be successful in this unit B that will then influence and support the success of the entire corporation? So they're on the ground, if you will. They're doing the work. They're the heads of the departments in the university. And you don't see us as professors. We're way down on this list. We didn't make the cut. But that's kind of how the strategy hierarchy flows. And as I said, we become more and more specific in terms of our objectives, in terms of our plans, in terms of our actions as we go down the hierarchy. So that's how it occurs. I've talked a little bit about that and just demonstrating the strategic levels, but more specifically, let's look at the strategic management process. There's two parts, if you will, to it. I'm sorry, three parts. The strategic management generally, which is the process of formulating, listen to this, and implementing strategies to accomplish long-term goals and to sustain competitive advantage. I want you to pay particular concern to two words here: formulating and implementing. So what that suggests to us, that there are two centric parts to strategic management. We first formulate, which is where we create our plans, and then once the plans are created, we must then what? We must then implement those plans. And if any of those are not done effectively, then the strategy is less likely to be successful. So you can have a great plan of action. You can spend a lot of time, do a lot of analysis, really devise a great plan, great strategic plan, and do a poor job of implementation, and you're not going to see success. Also, you can have a very poor formulated strategy, but try to effectively implement it, do it the way that it was constructed and do it well, but because it was a poor plan to begin with, you're not likely to see success from it. So it's important that those two parts are both effective, and also that they work together, that they complement each other. Because you have to you have to create good plans, you have to have good analysis, good ideas, but also you have to effectively implement it. In order to formulate a plan, you want to start with strategic analysis. And what is strategic analysis? It's the process of analyzing the organization, the environment, and its competitive position and current strategies. Well, where have you seen this before? Well, you've seen it in the planning process. If you remember, in the planning process, we said the first step was to define and determine what your objectives are. What do you want to accomplish? After that, though, you look at yourself, you look internally at where you are relative to your objectives. What do you do well? What do you don't do so well, your weaknesses? And also you looked at the environment for future scenarios, the opportunities and some of the obstacles that will present itself. That is what analysis is. It is looking at your goals, looking at yourself relative to those goals, and looking at the environment. That is strategic analysis. And so you see here, as I said, the three parts. You have first your analysis, which is your goal definition. What do I want to accomplish? And then assessing yourself relative to where you are. So it's where do I want to go? And let me apologize for that again. Where do I want to go? And then where am I should say, relative to where I actually want to be. That's what you're doing strategic analysis. You're assessing your position vis-a-vis your final objectives. That's strategic analysis. Once I've done my strategic analysis, I must then do my formulation. I must choose an alternative. I must evaluate what I can do, what are the options available to me, and then decide upon where I want to, or how I want to go about realizing these goals. And that's where I choose and create my strategies, right, for the corporate, the business, and the functional levels. And once that's done, I must then put my strategies into action, which is strategic implementation. So we start off with analysis. What do I want to achieve? Where I am right now relative to those goals. Secondly, strategic formulation. I choose, I decide, I create a specific plan of action. How am I going to achieve this? And then thirdly, I put it into action. This is how I will actually bring my ideas, my thoughts, my plans into reality. Okay, so that's the three stages, if you will: analysis, formulation, and implementation. What is formulation? Well, it's the process of creating strategy. How do I do that? It says it involves assessing existing strategies, organization, and environment to develop new strategies and strategic plans capable of delivering future competitive advantage. Basically, when I formulate strategy, I look at what my goals are, what I want to achieve. I look at who I am. What am I bringing to the table? What am I good at? And what am I not so good at? And I also look at the environment. What are consumers demanding? What is the new thing perhaps? What can I, or what markets are opening up? And I also look at some of the obstacles, some of the hindrances, some of the threats. Okay, what's happening in the political landscape? What's happening in the economy? What is happening in terms of what my competitors are doing or have already done? And what I am doing in strategic formulation, this is a very, very important part to this whole discussion, is that I am trying to match, listen to this, I am trying to match what I am good at, what my strengths are, with what the environment requires of me. Where do consumers care most about? And if I can find a good and unique match there, meaning if I can do something, if I can deliver some value to consumers in a way that hasn't been done or better than my existing competitors, then I am likely to be successful. So in a strategic formulation, I am what? I am matching my strengths with the environment's opportunity. Think again about Apple. Why is Apple so successful? Well, one, Apple is very, very good at innovation, with coming up with new things, exciting things, right, that can actually make our lives easier, or at least they tell us that. Well, no matter how good Apple is in doing that, if there was no market for the types of products that Apple can create, Apple would not be very successful. So although they have a strength in terms of innovation, if as consumers we did not care for innovation or that type of innovation, Apple would not be successful. In order for their strategy to work, there must be what we call an opportunity. people actually do value. They're willing and able to purchase those types of products. There is a demand for them. And because Apple can fulfill that demand better than the majority of its competitors, it has a competitive advantage. So when it formulates its strategy, it chooses opportunities or to go after opportunities that its strengths can most uh, effectively leverage. Okay, it can go after things that its strength can most effectively leverage because that's what it's good at and that's the opportunity that it can meet. Okay, there are certain things Apple will not do because it's not very good at it. Now, Apple doesn't sell a lot of low-end electronics or low-end products. And is there a market for that? Of course there is. And we know that because there are a lot of cheap tablets on the market. There are a lot of cheap smartphones on the market. But Apple doesn't do that. It doesn't create that. Well, why doesn't it? There's an opportunity. Shouldn't it take advantage of that? No, it's not its strategy. And the reason why it is not Apple's strategy is because Apple does not have strengths that would allow it to produce and sell products at such a low price. It does not have strengths that allows the organization to be that low cost in order to sell at those low prices. And so Apple then chooses to not have or follow that type of strategy because it does not have the strengths to do that. Okay? So firms determine their strategy based on their strengths as well as based on the environment's opportunities. Very, very important. And as we said, once it has been formulated, the next step is to implement it. It's implementation. And what do we do in implementation? We actually make our strategy some tangible entity. We put it into practice. And how do we do that? We allocate resources and to put the strategies into action. All organization and management systems must be mobilized into this to support and reinforce the accomplishment of strategies. And I guess one good way to illustrate this would be to use my class. And I spoke about it already in my strategy class. I asked my students to run a fictitious business. This year it was a business that was selling tablets, and they had some choices of strategy. And so when they formulated their strategies, one team, let's say for example, chose that they were going to be the low cost leader. They were going to try to sell their tablets at the cheapest prices in the market. Another team decided that they were going to be the differentiator, they were going to be the unique, they were going to put all these, services and all these different things into their tablets to make it the best and the most innovative, and they were going to charge higher prices for that because there were some consumers that wanted those things. And then there was a third strategy available where, some teams decided, what, we're going to be more customer focused. We're going to give people more of a customized experience. We're going to have more personal services and all those kinds of things. So all of these strategies, and I mentioned to my students, all of these strategies were likely to be as successful as the others. So it was not necessarily the choice of strategy that determined the success, but whether or not you can effectively implement that strategy. And so when students started to actually run the simulation and do the operation, I saw some inconsistencies in terms of their implementation. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, let's take, for example, the low cost strategy. Okay, some teams decided that they wanted to have the lowest cost in the market. Well, how do you actually implement that strategy? Well, the way that you implement that strategy is by trying to increase your production volume as much as you can, because with volume you get these things called economies of scale, and that allows you to have a lower cost structure and therefore price your items at a much lower rate. And so your production strategy should be to increase your volume. You want to buy machines that will allow you to produce more, that are more efficient. Okay, that's the type of tactical implementation that will support your low-cost strategy. Now, as a low-cost leader, you're not going to spend a ton of money on getting new innovation or creating these new innovations, because if you do that, what's going to happen, it is going to increase your cost, and it's not going to allow you to have lower prices. And that's what some teams did. They wanted to be low cost, but then they went out and research and development, and they created and they introduced all of these new services and new technologies, but that did not allow them to sell at a lower price. So you have to allocate your resources such that it supports your strategy. You cannot try to be the low cost leader and be spending money, a ton of money, on research and development. No, that's what a differentiator would do. Okay, a differentiator would spend a lot of money in research and development because that's how they are going to make their money. Similarly, if you are a differentiator, if you're trying to be unique, then you have to spend a lot of money on advertising, and you have to spend a lot of money on marketing, perhaps, because you want to ensure that customers recognize your brand, recognize that it's different from others, and therefore they are going to be more willing to pay for it. You cannot spend you cannot spend a little amounts of money on marketing and things of that nature and expect everyone to know who you are and to purchase you and to spend and pay more for you if they don't know your brand. And so you have to, what I'm saying to you is that you have to support your strategy. You have to support your strategy. Think about a restaurant, a very high-end restaurant. Their strategy is, of course, to be unique and to create value through a unique experience. Think about a restaurant like Commander's Palace in New Orleans. Well, the wait staff in Commander's Palace should be, and I've never been there personally, so I'm just saying hypothetically, they should be well trained. They should not just be picking up people, college students or high school students from off the street with no wait service experience and putting them into that type of organization, because the wait staff is very important in order for that organization to successfully implement its strategy. You need a great wait staff. You need a very intelligent and experienced wait staff, because they are a major part of the experience of that restaurant. And so you have to ensure that you spend and invest money in qualified, experienced, and the best type of wait staff if you are running that type of restaurant. But if you're doing a fast food restaurant, which is where it's not necessarily that important to have the best wait staff, then yes, you can take people off the street, high school students that are trying to make a quick $1 for the summer, because you don't need that. You have to determine where you're spending the money. As I said, the trade-offs. Where am I going to spend the money? Where am I going to allocate resources? And where am I not? That is why strategic implementation is so important. When you are formulating your strategy, this is some of the questions that you should ask yourself. Well, first is, well, what is my business mission? Why am I here? What am I here to do? What types of products do I sell? But most importantly, what is my value proposition? How am I going to serve customers in a way that is different from what is already being done? Related to that is, I ask you, who are my customers? Who are they? What do they look like? What is their profile? What do they want? What do they value? What have been our results? What have we done so far? What have we done well, and what have we haven't done well? And then what is our existing plan? You start off, of course, in terms of your mission, right? Why do I exist? Good mission statements ask questions like, what are we moving to? Okay? We know where we are now, but where do we want to be? Remember, the first thing is defining your objectives. What is our dream? What kind of difference do we make? What value do we add to society? Why are we in business? And what do we want to be known for? When people hear that name, when they hear Walmart, they hear Apple, Johnson & Johnson, Xavier University, or your business when you started, what would they think about you? What would be the first word that they will use to describe you? Okay? And the test of a mission could be how well it serves the stakeholders. What we're doing, what our stakeholders, customers, employees, suppliers, what have you, is that what they want from us? And if it isn't what they want from us, then we're not perhaps serving our, because remember, we're in business to serve our stakeholders. And so if we're not serving our stakeholders, then something is wrong. If we have a mission that is not coinciding with the needs and the wants of our customers and our other stakeholders, then maybe we need to relook or take another look at that and adapt our mission. We know what stakeholders are, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But this is kind of how it is related to our mission, okay? Mission addresses these stakeholders. Look at employees, the community, suppliers, customers, shareholders, and we want to ensure that we're serving them in our mission. We also look at core values. Core values are going to be the guiding principles that will allow us to fulfill our mission, okay? What do we believe in? How do we want to actually go about fulfilling this mission? Do we want to be ethical? Do we want to be honest? Do we want to be highly competitive, innovative? What do we most strongly believe in? Because our principles really are going to be the blood. They're going to be the motivating drivers to how we're fulfilling our mission. And then our objectives, they flow from our mission and they're guided by our values, but they're a little more specific than just our mission. We want to be the best, we want to be the leader. That's great, but as we said, goals, real good goals, they have to have some level of specificity and they must be able to be measured. So a lot of times, when we're looking or creating objectives for businesses, we're looking at things like profitability, sustainability, financial health, social responsibility, market share, and innovation. Finding specific areas, specific objectives, and trying to measure them. So hopefully, by doing these things, we will be fulfilling our mission. We look at our organizational resources and our capabilities. And why we do this is because, again, we want to see what are we best at. What are we best? Not just what are we okay at, what are we good at, but what are we best at? Okay, we want to see find out our core competency, because it's a core competency that's going to give us this competitive advantage. I was looking recently at this show, America's Got Talent, and a question that the judges kept asking some of the contestants was, what's your act? They were basically asking, what makes you different? Yeah, you got a good voice and you play the guitar, but what's going to separate you from the rest of the hundreds of thousands of people out there that can sing or that can dance or play an instrument? What's your act? What's your core competence? What makes you unique? Are you Walmart? Do you have the lowest cost structure? Are you Apple with the innovation? Are you Starbucks with the experience? What is it? What is it about you that's going to make you? Are you a Legion with the low fears? I mean, what's going to separate you? And it's important for you to identify that, because again, that's going to be the cornerstone of your competitive advantage. And some of the areas you said, knowledge, something that you might have some type of knowledge, some special that others don't have, superior technology, efficient supply chains, unique product distribution. Now, I know many of you are thinking about starting your own business or finding out ways when you're working in existing organizations and you want to create and sustain this competitive advantage. And what you have to ask yourself is, what is unique about me or my organization? What am I bringing to, what can I bring to the table that others haven't brought to the table? Yes, and that really is important, because that's what's going to separate you initially, but also allow you to sustain that separation from your competitors. You have to find an act. You have to find, I hate to use this term, but it's somewhat appropriate. You have to find a gimmick to some extent. What is going to separate me? And obviously, you don't want it to be just something relatively incremental. Well, they make red beans and rice, and my red beans are a little bit creamier than their. Well, yes, but is that such a difference that people are going to be wowed by you? Think about Dragos. Think about Dragos and their charbroiled oysters. I mean, this is a distinct dish that has separated this restaurant from many restaurants in this region and probably in the United States. Okay, think of Cafe Du Monde with their beignets. They're not the only people, but they have a gimmick. They have something unique about them. Okay, and it could be from all areas of the organization and the supply chain. You can find areas of distinction in all parts of the organization. But you have to find something that customers value. And we do this, when we're doing the formulation, we often use what's called a SWOT analysis. SWOT analysis. Have you heard of this term, SWOT analysis, before? I'm guessing that you have. And basically what a SWOT analysis is an examination, as we talked about before, of who we are, as well as an examination of where we are. So we look at our internal, and we also look at the external. Internal tells us about our strengths. What do we do well and what creates value? And weaknesses, what do we do not do so well and what perhaps endangers value creation? And then, of course, in the environment, we're looking at opportunities and threats. Opportunities are avenues to increase our success by either increasing our revenue or decreasing our cost. And threats, conversely, are obstacles. They either decrease our revenue or increase our cost. And this is somewhat what a SWOT might look like. You ask things like, what are our strengths here? It could be manufacturing, skill, workforce, good market share. And what are our weaknesses? Maybe we don't have enough in R&D. And then when you look at the environment, you say, okay, what opportunities? What are the new markets out there? Are there strong economies or poor economies? What are the rivals? What are the new technologies going on? You look at a macro, micro environment. And then also the threats. New competitors, maybe lack of resources are coming. It is important to do that because, as I said, an effective strategy is one that matches what the firm does well, its strength, with the external opportunities. What do customers want? What is out there in the market? What are the opportunities? You have to match your strengths with the opportunities in order to have an effective strategy. This is something that we often use when we're discussing external analysis, and it is looking at the level of competition in an industry. And I'm not going to spend too much time in that because when I teach strategy, I normally go into Porter's 5 forces more in depth. But Porter's 5 forces is a useful tool for analyzing external environments. And Porter's argument was this: the most attractive industry for any organization is one that has many opportunities and few threats. And conversely, an unattractive industry is one that has very many threats and very few opportunities. And he said an attractive industry, therefore, is one that has the least amount of competition. And an unattractive industry is one that has the most amount of competition. So I don't know if you have, I'm pretty certain that a lot of you have traveled, but if you go into the airport, and I've been in airports, many airports recently, and you go to purchase certain items, you would probably realize that those items are much more expensive than if you were to buy them, regularly on the same items, perhaps. If you go into McDonald's or you go to Popeyes, it's a little bit more expensive than if you were just in the city. Well, why is that? Why is popcorn so expensive in the movie theater? Well, it is because of competition, or the lack of competition. Because there is no competition, or very little competition in places like airports or in the movie theater, then those organizations, can charge higher prices and be able to woo customers. Lack of competition. Porter's argument is this: that it is in the firm's best interest to get into markets or get into industries where there is little or no competition. And therefore, a monopolistic environment where there is only one real competitor is the best place for organizations. Now, it's not necessarily the best for consumers because, of course, you have no choices. And if you have no choices, then you can't necessarily demand anything. Think about your energy bill. The energy goes up. My wife just showed me our energy bill, and she said, guess what? We use less energy than we did last year, but our bill is 20% more than it is last year. Well, there's nothing that I can do. I can't call Entergy and say, I'm sorry, I'm switching to potato or windmill energy right now. I can't do it, right? It's not available. So I have to basically pay that price because of lack of competition. And Porter says these four forces all influence this fifth force of industry competition. One of these forces is the new entrants, the threat of new competitors entering the market. And Porter argues that if that threat is high, if it's pretty easy for competitors to enter your market, then you're more likely to have an unattractive industry. So if a lot of people can kind of come in and flood your market, then obviously you can no longer rule. You can no longer charge any prices because you have no leverage. That's what Porter says. Okay, more competitors or competitors being able to easily get into your market is going to hurt your competitiveness, and that's the argument there. What are bargaining power of suppliers? Well, suppliers are simply people that give us our resource inputs. If they are requiring us to pay more for their supplies, then that's going to hurt our financial bottom line, isn't it? And so when those suppliers have bargaining power over us as firms in our industry, we are going to be in an unattractive industry. That's going to be a significant threat. Think of computers. Think of computers right now, okay? The computer industry, the general desktop industry is on the decline. And a lot of the reasons for that is because of powerful suppliers. Those computers like Dell or HP, a lot of times you're not buying it because it's a Dell or because of HP. You're really buying it because you want Microsoft and you want Intel. Well, Microsoft and Intel are the suppliers. And because they're so strong and powerful, they can ask those companies to pay higher prices. And because of that, that again hurts the competitiveness of those PC companies and makes their industries unattractive. Okay? How about the bargaining power of customers? Well, it says it's the ability of customers to influence the price they pay for products. When customers have power, businesses hurt. Think about what's going on in the airline industry right now. If you were booking a flight to Chicago, you have a myriad of airlines that you could potentially choose from. And because there is so much choice, then one airline can't necessarily charge a huge price because nobody would buy them. Nobody would necessarily want them. And so because of all this choice, airlines have to be more competitive in their prices, right? Think of what would happen, going back to my energy example, if there were 4 or 5 energy companies in New Orleans. Well, Entergy could not necessarily raise their prices that much unless everybody else raised their prices, and then it could probably be a question of collusion. But they couldn't raise their prices that much because if they did, then they would go out of business or they would lose many of their customers. I remember I just recently took a trip to China. And when I was at China, I went to one of these, or a couple of these outdoor markets. And a big thing when you go to these outdoor markets in China is that you're doing a lot of negotiating, you're doing a lot of haggling. And many times in these outdoor markets, you know, the storefronts or the people, the vendors that are selling, they're selling kind of the same thing. And so, you know, you go to one of them and you say, you know, what's the price? And they tell you a price and you say, no, I don't like that. I'm moving. And then they call you back and we negotiate. Well, the reason why they can do that, or you can do that as a consumer, I should say, is because you have options. They know that you can walk down literally 2 storefronts away and buy the same thing at a lower price. So they don't want to lose your business. But if there's nobody else there, okay, I'll give you a perfect example. I was just in Europe, and I wanted to buy chocolates for my son, and I had no chance to buy them when I was in the city, so I ended up in the airport, and so I'm looking for chocolates. There are only a couple of places that are selling chocolates. If I don't buy it there, there's no other place to buy it, and I really wanted the chocolate, so I had to pay the price. It was a very high price. I did not have power, and so therefore that firm benefited from that. So firms don't want their consumers to have power, their customers. They don't want their suppliers to have power, and they don't want lots of competition entering their market. The last force is substitute products. Substitute products aren't necessarily what we call direct competitors, but they're products or services that can do about the same job, that can fulfill the same need, but just in an alternative way. So let's say, for example, a substitute product for coffee would be energy drinks. Yeah. So you see right now, 5 Hour Energy, they have the commercials on television saying, this is better than the coffee. This is better than the caffeine. This doesn't give you that kind of weird high or whatever. It's better. And so what they're doing is they're proposing their product as a substitute for something like coffee. And if those energy drinks, and they have become popular, then they become a direct, or they become a strong competitive force to what? To the coffee industry. Okay? Think about generic drugs versus luxury brand drugs, or more designer drugs. They have become a strong competitive substitute. Okay? Instead of buying the brand name, you buy the generic, and essentially you are substituting the generic for the brand. And that is again a competitive force. When substitutes occur in the market, they place a strong negative threat, or they pose a strong negative threat to industries. Again, going back to PCs and laptops, they're hurting right now because many people, instead of buying a desktop or laptop, might buy a smartphone or might buy a tablet. These have become substitutes, and they have now made those industries very unattractive. So that gives you an idea again about how you can tell what is the best market for you. And that's why a lot of times people say, oh, I want to open up a restaurant in New Orleans. Well, do you think that's the wisest thing in the world? Think about how many competitors there are in New Orleans, how many choices that consumers have. Think about the suppliers, right? They have many, many options in which to sell their suppliers. What's going to make you different? Is this a really good industry for you? Or is this something that will be very, very difficult? That's why there aren't that many restaurants that make it in New Orleans. There are a lot of them that open up, but a lot of them that don't necessarily make it. The industry is not necessarily all that attractive. And that, in a nutshell, is our first brief lecture.